Several years back, I was completing a series of sessions with someone I'd been working with for quite some time. We'd made tremendous progress on the initial concerns that brought them to my office. And as we prepared to conclude our work together, I posed a question that I typically ask when treatment is winding down. I wanted to know if there were any remaining challenges they felt we should address before parting ways. The response I received caught me completely off guard and would ultimately reshape my entire understanding of what people truly struggle with in their daily lives. This individual looked at me with a mixture of vulnerability and frustration and asked something I'd never been asked before in all my years of clinical work. They wanted to know if I could help them stop feeling like what they called an outsider never quite fits in no matter how hard they try. They used a particular word to describe this feeling, and when I asked them to elaborate on what they meant, the explanation that followed was both heartbreaking and remarkably common. Most people never articulate it quite so clearly. The person explained that they experienced a persistent pattern in their social life that left them feeling fundamentally disconnected from the people around them. Friendships, certainly, and they were included in various social activities and gatherings. On the surface, their social life might have appeared perfectly adequate. But beneath that surface, there was a painful reality they couldn't ignore. When invitations came their way, whether for parties, weekend adventures, or casual hangouts, they were always included, yet their presence or absence seemed to carry no real weight. If they showed up, it was nice. If they didn't, nobody particularly minded. There was no sense that their contribution to these gatherings mattered in any meaningful way. They described a dynamic where they maintained connections with various people, but these relationships felt fundamentally imbalanced. They found themselves thinking about their friends constantly, initiating plans and conversations, reaching out to maintain the connections, investing emotional energy into keeping these relationships alive. Meanwhile, their friends seemed to think about them considerably less. Reciprocity they craved simply wasn't there. They weren't central to anyone's life. They weren't the person someone would call first with exciting news or in a moment of crisis. They occupied a space on the periphery of multiple social circles, always present, but never truly essential. When they described being in group settings, they experienced a persistent sense of not quite belonging. There was an awkwardness they couldn't shake, a feeling of being slightly out of sync with everyone else, as though they were performing a role rather than naturally inhabiting a space in the group. This wasn't social anxiety in the clinical sense, and it wasn't a lack of social skills in the obvious ways. It was something more subtle and perhaps more painful, a sense that despite doing everything they thought they should be doing, they remained on the outside looking in. I needed to understand when this pattern had crystallized into something they recognized as a problem rather than just a vague discomfort. That's when they shared a story that illustrated the entire dynamic with painful clarity. About a month before our conversation, they had decided to host a birthday celebration. This wasn't a casual decision or a last-minute plan. They had spent days preparing, investing significant time and effort into creating an experience they hoped would bring their friends together and perhaps demonstrate their value to these relationships. The preparation was extensive and thoughtful. They spent 3 full days cooking, planning a menu that would showcase their skills and provide something special for their guests. They brined chicken for 24 hours in advance to ensure it would be perfectly seasoned and tender. They made desserts from scratch. They created their own dips and accompaniments. Every detail was considered, every element crafted with care. This wasn't just throwing together some snacks and sending out invitations. This was someone pouring their heart into an event, trying to create something memorable that would bring joy to the people they cared about. When they extended invitations to their friends, the initial response seemed promising. Everyone expressed enthusiasm. They said they were absolutely planning to attend. They talked about how great it would be, how much they were looking forward to it, how they wouldn't miss it. Based on these responses, this person believed they would be hosting a house full of friends, celebrating together, enjoying the fruits of all that preparation and effort. When the day arrived, something devastating happened. One by one, or perhaps all at once, it became clear that nobody was coming. There were no last-minute apologies, no explanations, no acknowledgement of the commitment they had made. The person sat alone with all that carefully prepared food, with a home set up for celebration, with the emotional investment of someone who had truly believed their friends valued them enough to show up. The silence was deafening. The absence was absolute. And the message, intentional or not, was unmistakable. As we explored this situation together, we began to identify patterns in how this individual approached their relationships. These weren't obvious mistakes or clear social missteps. They were subtle strategies that made perfect sense from a certain perspective, but were ultimately counterproductive. This person had developed an entire repertoire of behaviors designed to secure their place within various social groups. And at the heart of all these behaviors was a kind of transaction. They were essentially trying to increase their value in the eyes of others through external offerings rather than through authentic connection. Whenever there was a group activity being planned, they would immediately look for ways to make themselves indispensable. If friends were organizing a weekend trip, they would volunteer to handle logistics, to drive, to manage accommodations, take on responsibilities that would make their inclusion feel necessary rather than optional. The underlying logic was straightforward. If they made themselves useful enough, if they contributed enough value, people would want them around. But this logic contained a fatal flaw. What was actually happening was more complex and more painful. At some level, this person lived with a persistent anxiety about being excluded. They sensed, probably accurately, that they existed on the edges of their social groups rather than at the center. This awareness created a fear of being pushed out entirely, of losing even the peripheral position they occupied. So every behavior, every offer of help, every attempt to add value was motivated not by genuine generosity or authentic desire to contribute, but by a desperate need to prove they deserved to be included. When I began working with them on this issue, found myself in unfamiliar territory professionally. This wasn't quite the domain of traditional clinical practice. Initial instinct was to approach it the way I'd been trained to approach any presenting problem, look for a diagnosis. I considered whether this might be manifestation of social anxiety disorder. I wondered if their might be some neurodevelopmental factor at play that was affecting their social intuition. I ran through the various pathologies that might explain these difficulties. The reality was that what they were describing didn't fit neatly into any diagnostic category. This wasn't a disorder requiring treatment in the medical sense. It wasn't a pathology that could be addressed with medication or standard therapeutic interventions. What they were experiencing was better understood as a collection of issues related to self-perception, social positioning, and interpersonal skills. These were problems that could be improved, patterns that could be changed, but not through traditional psychiatric treatment. Realization represented a turning point, not just for this individual, but for my own professional evolution. Began to recognize that many people struggle with challenges that don't meet criteria for mental illness, but nonetheless cause significant distress and impairment in their lives. These are the issues that fall between the cracks of traditional healthcare, the problems that aren't serious enough to warrant medical intervention, but are certainly serious enough to diminish quality of life, limit opportunities, and create persistent unhappiness. As I worked with this person over subsequent weeks and months, we developed an understanding of the dynamics at play and, more importantly, strategies for fundamentally changing their social position. The core insight was deceptively simple but profound in its implications. The behaviors they had been engaging in, the strategies they thought were keeping them connected to their social groups, were actually the very things keeping them stuck on the periphery. Think about it this way: there's a fundamental difference between trying to avoid being pushed away and trying to move closer to the center. These might sound like two ways of describing the same goal. They're actually completely different orientations with completely different outcomes. When your primary focus is on not being ejected, on not losing your tentative position, you engage in behaviors designed to minimize risk. You make yourself small, unthreatening, agreeable. You don't rock the boat. You don't draw too much attention. You certainly don't challenge the existing hierarchy or compete with the people at the center of the group. But here's the problems. These defensive, risk-averse behaviors, while they might help you maintain your peripheral position, will never elevate you to a more central role. The very actions you take to avoid being pushed out are the actions that keep you from being pulled in. You're engaged in what I started calling clinging behaviors rather than climbing behaviors. You're holding on for dear life rather than ascending. As I dove deeper into this issue, I discovered that there's actually substantial research on these dynamics, though it doesn't come from psychiatric or psychological literature. Illuminating work has been done by researchers studying social networks, the mathematical and structural properties of how humans connect with one another. These researchers have identified patterns and principles that explain with remarkable precision why some people end up at the centers of their social worlds while others remain on the edges. There's a particular concept from network science that proved invaluable in understanding and addressing these challenges. It's a measure of how central or important a node is within a network, taking into account not just how many connections that node has, but the quality and position of those connections. In the context of human relationships, this measure captures something crucial about social power and respect. It's not just about how many people about who those people are and how they connect to others. Let me paint a picture of how social groups actually function when you map them out structurally. Imagine a diagram where each person is represented by a point, and lines connect people who have relationships with each other. What you'll notice immediately is that these networks are never uniform. There are always people who appear at the center with many connections radiating outward. And there are always people at the edges with fewer connections, often connecting to the network through just one or two people. In your own social experiences, you've undoubtedly noticed this pattern. Every group has individuals who seem to be the glue holding things together. These are the people who organize gatherings, whose presence makes or breaks an event, whose homes become the natural meeting places, whose opinions carry weight in group decisions. When they suggest doing something, people make it happen. When they don't show up to something, others question whether it's even worth attending. Everyone wants to be friends with these central figures, even if they're not always particularly likable in obvious ways. Then there are the people at the edges. They're invited, they're included, but they're not essential. They're part of the group in a technical sense, but they're not part of the group's identity or core. These are the people whose absence goes unnoticed, whose input is overlooked, whose attempts to influence group plans are gently ignored or overruled. The question that matters then is, how does someone move from the edges toward the center? What are the mechanisms that elevate social position and increase respect within a group? This is where the research becomes both fascinating and actionable. The first principle, which may seem counterintuitive if you're currently struggling on the periphery of your social groups, that increasing your centrality begins with expanding the total number of connections you have, particularly weak connections with people outside your immediate circle. This sounds backwards, right? If you're already struggling to be important to the people you currently know, why would you invest energy in forming new connections that are even more superficial? Here's why this matters. People are stuck on the edges of a social group. They tend to make a specific mistake, pour all their energy into trying to become more important to that particular group of people. They focus intensively on the relationships they already have, trying to deepen them, trying to prove their worth, trying to earn a more central position through sheer effort and dedication. This is the approach that leads to things like preparing elaborate birthday parties that nobody attends. This strategy is fundamentally flawed because it's trying to change the structure from within when you don't have the structural position to do so. You can't become more central to a group by trying harder to be central to that same group, at least not directly. Instead, you need to build a foundation that gives you the confidence, the options, and ultimately the positioning that makes centrality possible. This is where weak connections come in. A weak connection is exactly what it sounds like, a relationship that isn't particularly deep or emotionally intimate, but exists nonetheless. It's someone you know casually, you might chat with occasionally, someone who exists in your broader network without being a close friend. People often dismiss these connections as not valuable precisely because they lack depth. If you're lonely and craving meaningful relationships, the last thing you want to hear is that you should invest in more superficial ones. Weak connections serve crucial functions that have nothing to do with emotional intimacy. First, they expand your sense of your own social viability. When you have connections across multiple contexts and groups, even if those connections are casual, you start to feel less dependent on any single group for your entire social identity. This reduces the anxious clinging that keeps you stuck on the periphery of your current group. Second, and this is crucial, weak connections are the raw material from which strong connections are built. You can't form a deep friendship without first forming a casual acquaintance. And the more casual acquaintances you have, the more opportunities you create for some of those relationships to naturally develop into something more substantial. Third, weak connections across different groups create possibilities for what network researchers call bridging, which we'll return to because it's absolutely central to understanding social power. But the basic idea is that the person who connects different groups, who knows people in multiple contexts and can introduce them to each other, gains respect and importance that goes far beyond what their individual relationships might suggest. So the first practical step, especially if you're currently on the edges of your social world, is to deliberately create opportunities to meet new people in different contexts. This doesn't mean abandoning your current friendships. It means expanding your social world so that you're not putting all your emotional eggs in one basket, so to speak. Now, having weak connections is just the starting point. The second principle is about how those weak connections transform into strong ones, because ultimately, it's the strong connections that provide the sense of belonging and mattering that we all crave. And there's a surprisingly straightforward mechanism that drives this transformation: repeated interactions over time. This is one of those findings from research that seems almost too simple to be meaningful, but it's actually incredibly powerful when you understand what it implies. Relationships strengthen through consistency and repetition. When you see someone regularly, when you interact with them across multiple contexts and occasions, when you share experiences and conversations repeatedly, the relationship naturally deepens. Trust builds. Familiarity grows. Inside jokes develop. History accumulates. The relationship takes on significance simply because it persists. This has important implications for how you approach your social life. If you're currently in that peripheral position where you have various weak connections, but nothing feels particularly solid or reciprocal, the path forward isn't to have one really amazing interaction with someone. It's not to have the perfect conversation or to impress someone so much in a single encounter that they immediately want to be your best friend. It's to create structures and habits that lead to repeated interactions with the same people over time. This is where we return to those weak connections across different groups. If you start spending time with people who are themselves on the edges of your current social circle, if you organize small gatherings or one-on-one hangouts with these individuals specifically, something interesting happens. Relationships strengthen significantly. You're not competing for attention with the central figures of the group. You're not trying to prove your worth in a context where the hierarchy is already established. You're building relationships on your own terms in contexts where you can be more fully yourself. And here's what's really interesting. As you form these stronger connections with people who were previously just weak connections, Your overall position in the social network begins to shift. You're no longer solely dependent on your connection to the central figures for your place in the network. You start to have your own sphere of relationships, your own subsection of the network where you actually matter to people. Brings us to the third major principle, which is in many ways the most powerful, the concept of betweenness. This is where things get really interesting and where you can most dramatically change your social position. Betweenness refers to the extent to which you serve as a bridge between different parts of a network. If you think about the structure of social connections, some people connect clusters that would otherwise be separate. They know people in different contexts, from different parts of their life, from different social worlds, and they bring these people together. The person who serves this bridging function gains a tremendous amount of social respect and importance, often disproportionate to any other characteristic they might have. This is the essence of why networking matters and why certain approaches to networking are far more effective than others. Most people think about networking in terms of what they can get from others. They go to networking events looking for people who can help them, who can advance their career, who can open doors. They're focused on moving up by association, connecting with people who are already powerful or successful or influential. This approach to networking is fundamentally extractive and ultimately limited in its effectiveness. The people who are already powerful and successful are constantly being approached by others who want something from them. They develop pretty good filters for detecting when someone is interested in them primarily for what they can provide. And even when these interactions are pleasant enough, they rarely lead to relationships of real substance. The most effective approach to networking and to social positioning more generally is actually to become someone who connects others. Instead of asking what each person can do for you, you ask what you might be able to do by connecting different people you know to each other. When you notice that one person you know is looking for something that another person you know can provide, and you facilitate that connection without needing to be involved beyond the introduction, something powerful happens. You're providing genuine value to both parties without asking for anything in return. You're not trying to gain from the interaction. You're just helping people out, making useful connections, being genuinely helpful. And in doing so, you establish yourself as someone valuable to know, not because of what you have or who you are in some absolute sense, but because you increase the value of everyone else's network. Every time you successfully connect two people who benefit from knowing each other, your own status in both their minds increases. They remember you as someone who helped them. They think of you as someone who knows interesting people, who has a broad network, who might be able to help again in the future. They want to maintain their connection with you because that connection might lead to other valuable connections down the line. This dynamic creates a positive feedback loop. The more you connect others, the more people want to stay connected to you. As your network grows and becomes more diverse, you have even more opportunities to make meaningful connections between different people. Your betweenness increases, and with it, your centrality and respect within your various social circles. Phenomenon that illustrates this principle beautifully, something you may have witnessed in school settings. When a new person joins an established social group, one of two things typically happens. Either they get quickly pushed to the periphery, unable to break into the existing structure, or they somehow become immediately central to the group, with the existing social dynamics rearranging themselves around this newcomer. Why does this happen? Is it just about charisma or attractiveness or some ineffable quality the new person has or doesn't have? Those factors might play a role, but there's often a more structural explanation. When a new person arrives from somewhere else, potentially represent a bridge to an entirely different social world. They know people that the existing group doesn't know. They have connections to another place, another context, another network entirely. If the existing group values these potential connections, if they see the newcomer as a gateway to something new and interesting, that person's betweenness makes them immediately valuable. They're not just another member of the group trying to find their place in an established hierarchy, a connection point to something beyond the group that gives them power and respect that has nothing to do with how long they've been around or how much effort they've put into cultivating relationships. This is why one of the most practical pieces of advice for increasing your social position is to deliberately create situations where you can introduce people from different parts of your life to each other. Organize large parties where you're desperately hoping everyone shows up and likes you. Instead, create small gatherings where you bring together a person from one context and a person from another context, people who wouldn't otherwise know each other, but who might genuinely benefit from or enjoy the connection. Maybe you invite someone from work and someone from your hobby group to grab dinner together. Maybe you organize a game night with a few people from different friend circles. Maybe you introduce two people virtually who you think would hit it off or who have complementary interests or skills. These small acts of connection making are far more powerful for building your own social position than any amount of effort to make yourself indispensable to an existing group structure. There's actually a context where I've observed this dynamic play out repeatedly in very clear ways: online gaming communities. These spaces often have established hierarchies and social structures. Watching how people navigate them reveals a lot about social dynamics more generally. I've had experiences where a friend invites me to join a new gaming group, a server or community where I don't know anyone except this one person. We show up together, and my friend will often say something like, "Hey, I brought someone along. He's really good at this particular role. Hope it's okay if he joins us." And the existing members of that community almost always say yes. Now there are three of us in this space where previously there were two separate social contexts: the established community and my friend's connection to me. That friend becomes the bridge, the person who links these worlds together. They're the glue that holds this new configuration together, at least initially. And that position gives them respect and importance that goes beyond any individual skill or contribution. The people in the server value my friend because my friend connected them to someone new who adds value to their gaming experience. I value my friend because they brought me into a new social context. Friends' position in both social worlds is strengthened by serving as the connection between them. When you understand this principle, you realize that the path To social centrality isn't about making yourself as agreeable and useful as possible to one group of people. It's about expanding your connections across different groups and contexts, strengthening those connections through repeated interactions, serving as a bridge that connects different parts of your social world. So, practically speaking, what does all this mean for someone who feels stuck on the periphery? It means you need to actively work on meeting new people, not in a desperate, I need friends kind of way. You're strategically expanding your network, creating weak connections that might develop into strong ones. It means spending intentional time with individuals or small groups, creating opportunities for repeated interactions that strengthen relationships. And it means organizing small gatherings or making introductions that position you as someone who connects others rather than who's trying to force their way into an existing social structure. There's a fourth major piece to this puzzle, and it's one that takes us back to where we started. The specific behaviors that people engage in when they're anxious about their social position. Because even as you're doing all these strategic things to build your network and increase your betweenness, if you're simultaneously engaging in behaviors that signal low status and low respect, you're undermining your own efforts. This is where we have to talk about the difference between behaviors designed to avoid ejection and behaviors that actually increase respect. This distinction is absolutely crucial because it's where most people who struggle socially make their biggest mistakes. When you're on the periphery of a social group and you're anxious about that position, you tend to engage in specific behaviors designed to make yourself non-threatening to the people at the center. The logic makes perfect sense. Seem threatening if I challenge the existing hierarchy, if I make the central people uncomfortable or insecure, they might push me out entirely. So instead, I'm going to make myself as small and agreeable and non-threatening as possible. One of the most common ways this manifests is through self-deprecating humor. When you make jokes at your own expense, when you laugh along when others tease you, when you minimize your own accomplishments or abilities, you're signaling that you're not a threat. You're saying, look, I know my place. I'm not trying to compete with you. You don't need to worry about me challenging your position. And in the very short term, this might achieve its goal. People might find you agreeable. They might appreciate that you're not causing drama or creating tension. But here's what you need to understand. Making yourself non-threatening through self-deprecation doesn't just signal that you're not a threat to the central people's position. It signals that you're not worthy of a higher position yourself. Every time you make a joke at your own expense, you're teaching people to think of you as someone who can be laughed at. Every time you downplay your own abilities or accomplishments, you're teaching people that you're not particularly capable or accomplished. These behaviors might prevent active rejection, absolutely prevent respect and admiration. The second major behavior pattern I see in people who are stuck on the periphery is downplaying expertise or skill. This is particularly visible in contexts where there's a clear hierarchy based on competence at something. In gaming communities, there's often one person who's recognized as the best player, the highest ranked, the most skilled, occupy a position of respect because of this demonstrated ability. Now, If you're someone who's actually quite good at the game, but you're currently on the periphery of this community, you face a choice. You could demonstrate your skill, show what you're capable of, potentially challenge the existing top dog for their position. Or you could deliberately underperform, hide your abilities, make sure you're not threatening to anyone's position in the hierarchy. Of people in this situation choose the second option. They're afraid that if they demonstrate their true skill level, outperform the person at the top, they'll create conflict or jealousy that leads to them being excluded. Make themselves smaller than they are. They hold back. They let others shine while they stay in the background. And again, this might work in the sense that it avoids immediate conflict, absolutely prevents you from gaining the respect that comes from demonstrated competence. You're keeping yourself stuck exactly where you are by refusing to show actually capable of. These clinging behaviors, come to think of them, serve a specific function. They're designed to maintain your current position, prevent you from being pushed out. The thing you have to understand is that behaviors designed to prevent you from losing ground are completely different from behaviors designed to help you gain ground. In fact, they're often directly opposed to each other. If your primary goal is to not get kicked out, you're going to make yourself small, non-threatening, agreeable, forgettable. If your primary goal is to increase respect and move toward the center, you need to make yourself notable, competent, interesting, memorable. These require completely different approaches. So here's what I recommend, and this is going to feel scary if you've been operating from a place of anxiety about your social position. First, engaging in self-deprecating humor. Just stop. No more jokes at your own expense. No more laughing along when others make fun of you. No more minimizing yourself. This doesn't mean you become arrogant or obnoxious. It doesn't mean you can't be humble or admit when you're wrong. It means you stop actively teaching people to think less of you. When someone compliments you, say thank you instead of deflecting. When you do something well, acknowledge it instead of pretending it was nothing. Treat yourself with the respect you want others to show you. If you're good at something, show it. If you have expertise or skills or knowledge, demonstrate them. If you're talented at something, that talent be visible. And here's the thing that's really important to understand. If people feel threatened by your competence, problem not yours. Now, I know that might sound harsh or risky. You might be thinking, but if I do that, the central people in my group will feel threatened and I'll get pushed out, which is exactly what I've been trying to avoid. And yes, that's a possibility. But here's what you need to understand if you're connected to other people and groups. If you've built those weak connections and strengthened them through repeated interactions, if you've positioned yourself as a bridge between different social contexts, then being pushed out of one group doesn't leave you socially isolated. You have other options, other connections, other contexts where you're valued. More importantly, there's actually fascinating research that shows how this plays out. There was a study published recently that examined the relationship between self-perception and how others perceive you. The findings were striking. The way you view yourself, your belief in your own capabilities and worth directly influences how other people respond to you. When you make yourself small, You signal through your behavior and words that you don't think much of yourself. Other people take that cue and treat you accordingly. They treat you as small because you're showing them that's how you should be treated. Conversely, when you demonstrate confidence in your abilities, when you show rather than hide what you're capable of, people respond to that confidence. Your respect in the eyes of others rises in direct proportion to your respect for yourself. This is why the sequence of steps matters so much. If you tried to demonstrate expertise and refused to engage in self-deprecating behavior while you were still completely dependent on one social group for your entire social identity, it would be extremely risky. If that group rejected you, you'd be left with nothing. If you've already built connections across multiple contexts, if you've already created a broader social network where you're serving as a bridge between different groups, demonstrating your competence becomes much safer, even if the people in your original group feel threatened. You have other places where you're valued and respected. And here's what often happens in practice. When you start showing your true capabilities, when you stop making yourself small, the respect you receive from others does increase. Yes, sometimes the people who were previously at the center of the group feel threatened. But remember, you're now connected to other people and groups. You're not entirely dependent on this one social context. In fact, frequently happens is that as you demonstrate expertise and confidence, as you show what you're actually capable of, you start to naturally move toward the center of your social groups, not through anxious striving or desperate attempts to prove your worth, but through genuine demonstration of value. The central people in your groups demonstrate expertise and confidence. That's part of what makes them central. When you do the same, you're adopting the behaviors associated with higher status rather than the behaviors associated with peripheral status. Let me be very clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying you should be arrogant or put others down or engage in constant self-promotion. I'm not saying you should be combative or deliberately create conflict. I'm not saying you should fake expertise you don't have or pretend to be something you're not. What I am saying is this actively diminishing yourself. Stop hiding what you're capable of, apologizing for taking up space or having opinions or being good at things. Engaging in behaviors specifically designed to signal that you're not a threat. Those same behaviors signal that you're not particularly valuable either. Be genuinely helpful to others. Don't do so from a place of desperate need to prove your worth. Connect people with each other. Do so because you genuinely think benefit from knowing each other, not because you're trying to secure your own position. Demonstrate your abilities, but do so in the natural course of activities rather than as a performance designed to impress. The difference is subtle but crucial. It's the difference between trying to earn respect through external offerings and simply behaving in ways that naturally command respect. It's the difference between clinging anxiously to your current position and climbing confidently toward a better one. When you put all these pieces together, when you expand your connections across different groups, strengthen those connections through repeated interactions, position yourself as a bridge between different social contexts, simultaneously stop engaging in behaviors that signal low status and low worth your social position transforms. You move from the periphery toward the center, not through any single dramatic action, but through a systematic shift in how you approach your social life. Person who came to me asking for help with this issue, the one who had prepared that elaborate birthday party that nobody attended through exactly this process. We worked together over several months to implement these principles. They started deliberately meeting new people in different contexts, joining new groups, pursuing new interests, not to abandon their existing friendships, but to expand their social world and reduce their dependence on any single group. They began organizing small gatherings with just 2 or 3 people from different parts of their life, creating opportunities for repeated interactions and positioning themselves as a connector. They stopped engaging in self-deprecating humor and started acknowledging their skills and accomplishments without apology. When they were good at something, they showed it instead of hiding it. The transformation wasn't instantaneous, and it wasn't always comfortable. There were moments of anxiety, moments of self-doubt, moments of wondering whether it was working. But gradually, unmistakably, things shifted. The quality of their relationships deepened. They found themselves being invited to things not as an afterthought, but because people genuinely wanted them there. They started receiving texts and calls from people just wanting to connect, not just responding to their own initiations. Most significantly, they stopped feeling like they were on the outside looking in. They stopped feeling like every social interaction was a performance where they had to prove they deserved to be included. They started feeling genuinely connected, genuinely valued, genuinely central to the lives of people who mattered to them. This is what's possible when you understand the underlying dynamics of social networks and when you're willing to change not just what you do, but how you think about social connection. You don't need to have some special charisma or extraordinary social skills. You don't need to be the funniest or the most interesting or the most anything. You just need to understand how social structures actually work and be willing to position yourself differently within those structures. The principles are actually remarkably simple once you understand them. Form connections across different groups. Strengthen those connections through repeated interactions. Position yourself as a bridge between different social contexts. Engaging in behaviors that signal low status, demonstrate your actual capabilities and value. Do things that help others without expecting immediate return. Be someone who adds value to others' networks rather than someone who's constantly trying to extract value. You smiling, none of this requires you to be someone you're not. In fact, the whole point is to stop pretending to be smaller or less capable than you are. The point is to show up more fully as yourself, to let your actual qualities and abilities be visible, connect authentically with others from a place of confidence rather than anxiety. Social connection is fundamental to human well-being. We're deeply social creatures, and the quality of our relationships has enormous impact on our happiness, our health, our sense of meaning and purpose. When those relationships feel imbalanced or unsatisfying, when we feel like we're always on the outside, when we sense that people don't really care about us the way we care about them, it creates a persistent ache that affects everything else in our lives. But these patterns aren't fixed. Your position in your social world isn't predetermined by your personality or your history or some innate quality you do or don't possess. It's determined by the behaviors you engage in, the strategies